Hello again, continuing our series on the Rhodesian Bush War. And the book we're going to discuss today concerns a major concept in the Bush War, the fire force. I first heard the term fire force on my first visit to Rhodesia. My host, Francis Rink, who was a real fighting man. He wasn't a young man, but he was a member of Part 2, the Police Anti-Terrorist Unit, and he'd actually fought in World War II in Anzio. And I was eliciting stories I'd never heard of Part 2 about how they operated, and he was telling me about a contact, and he said we tried to call for the fire force, and it was engaged elsewhere. It was a very, very busy time. And I said, "What's fire force?" And he explained to me. And that's the first time I heard about it. And it really was the mainstay of the countering the terrorist incursions in Rhodesia. And there's a book being written about it, which really completely covers the role. And it's this one, Counterstrike from the Sky, the Rhodesian All-Arms Fire Force in the War in the Bush, 1974 to 1980, by Professor JRT Wood. Now, he's a professor, so it's a very well-researched and scholarly book, but it's also highly readable. You can get a lot out of it. It's not dry by any means. It really takes you there into the action. He's got excellent sources. He is probably the preeminent historian on the Rhodesian conflict. So the whole thing really started as a result of a terrorist incursion around the Sonoya area. And at the time, the police were handling counter-terrorism, and they excluded the army from the operation and handled it themselves. And it just went wrong. Lots of mistakes were made. Anyway, like in a lot of good stuff originated from bad decisions and tactical errors, as long as the lessons are learned, and they certainly did learn the lessons. One was they needed radios that were compatible. The police couldn't talk to the Air Force helicopters, and the other was the helicopters all needed to orbit the same direction, in a counterclockwise direction, so that the door gunners could bear on the target. Professor Wood goes on to identify the essential tools of the fire force, which were the helicopter, the French Alouette 3, which was the ideal helicopter and possibly even the only helicopter at the time that was had the capability to operate in hot and high conditions, Rhodesia being several thousand feet above sea level and very hot country, and to operate in the thin, hot air, lifting a payload, a maximum payload. The alley fitted the bill perfectly. It was a very agile platform, and it also was resilient to ground fire, as they found out. So I believe it's still in service in parts of Southern Africa. I've flown in an alley. We used on one of the bodyguard courses, and terrific aircraft. The other tool was the 20mm French Matra 51 cannon, which was fitted to certain of the helicopters, and these were known as K cars. And the troop carrying helicopters were called G cars. And he goes into the reason for why they were named that way. So the fire force, briefly, the Rhodesians established a number of forward airfields throughout the country in strategic locations, and manned them with an element from the Air Force to fly and maintain the helicopters, and the ground troops who had either barracks or bivouacs on the FAF. And they would then receive information about a terrorist sighting, which was often from either Salute Scouts call sign or OP, or from some other, possibly from a contact. And they would scramble, and the fire force would do a very, very quick brief and then fly to the target. And as I mentioned in a previous review, the amount of very fast planning done by these guys was very impressive. And quite often the stick leader of the ground troops would be a corporal, and he had a lot of responsibility. The K car had the pilot who was in command of all the air aspects, so he would direct where the other helicopters should, what formation they should adopt, and how they should drop the troops, and also coordinate with the fixed wing assets who may be doing Frantan runs or machine gun runs. And the ground commander for the whole of the fire force would be next to him in the helicopter, and he would be directing the positioning of the troops, how they move through the bush and so on, because obviously had a great view. And the cannon was used to encourage the terrorists to move in a certain direction, or to kill exposed terrorists. The reason the 20mm worked so well was you could fire and hit rocks nearby, and the fragmentation effect would take down the targets rather than firing directly into the ground. So they wouldn't necessarily have to shoot directly onto the target. You could use some sort of ricochet effect. And the Fire Force developed, and Professor Wood talks about the jumbo Fire Force, where they used larger formations. 1977, they started using or sort of retraining the RLI in the parachute role, and included Dakotas. These were World War II era aircraft. Some of them had actually taken part in Arnhem, and they were called Paradox, and they were used to expand the role of the Fire Force. Then another big feature of the book is when the Rhodesians got into the massive camp attacks across the border, and some of these were done by ground columns, the Zulu Scouts in particular, with some of them big raids, the Mapai raid, Nzonya raid, things like that. But then they came up with the idea of just taking the Fire Force over the border. And the big example of this was Operation Dingo Zulu 1. The intelligence people had identified a massive complex at Chimoio where several thousand, the estimates varied, terrorists were in training, and it was beyond helicopter range of Rhodesia. And I've talked about this in Winds of Destruction, where Peter Petterboyer was involved from the air side. There's several thousand terrorists, and nearby were regular troops from Frelimo and barracks as well. The plan was amazing. Everything dovetailed together, and the Rhodesians actually deployed 185 personnel to attack the complex of thousands. Whereas normally in an attacking role, the military want 3-to-1 advantage. Here they were at a massive disadvantage. And at the end of the day, they only lost 2 guys, one on the ground and one from the air side. Amazing. One of the feats of soldiering throughout the ages. all highly detailed. It has diagrams of how it was all coordinated, and it really it does give the Fire Force the claim that the historian of the U.S. Marine Corps called the Rhodesian Fire Force the ultimate killing machine, and Operation Dingo Zulu 1 really did prove that. Just as a little point, I just want to quote something I've got here that an officer who was on Fire Force wrote in a book, and he said that the terrorists would either recruit or abduct young guys, take them into the neighboring countries, Mozambique, for example, give them training, and then deploy them back into Rhodesia to commit terrorist acts. They were never told about Fire Force, and there was no counter Fire Force tactics. And what this chap says was then sent right back into the meat grinder. Not knowing anything about Fire Force, the first time most of them even heard of that group was when everyone else around them had bombshelled, leaving them standing alone in the middle of a field, peering upward to see the 20 mil jerking backwards and the earth around them exploding. They didn't even know enough to raise their hands and surrender, so they would just stand there, looking around with an AK in their hands until it was truly and sadly the last thing they ever did. The first units really to have the Fire Force role were the SAS, but then their role had to expand and to cover the external operations they were doing. So it was passed to the RLI, and one of the RLI commandos was usually on Fire Force permanently in a rotational basis, and sometimes more than one. The RAR, Rhodesian African Rifles, also had Fire Force roles, and all of those units were very, very successful. But I think the one that everyone really recognised as during the bulk of the Bush War was the RLI. They really did embrace the Fire Force role, and going to war, as I've said before in one of these videos, just wearing shorts and hockey boots, minimum kit. It was amazing, and they got into a lot of contacts. They would quite often have several contacts in a day, several Fire Force call-outs, and the paras sometimes did up to 3 combat jumps in a day. So it was an amazing time, amazing piece of warrior history, and obviously Rhodesia doesn't exist anymore, but I think the memory of what they did lives on forever.